So I woke up the other morning to a couple of notifications on an old video I did about Karina Vetrano. If any of you don't know, I did about 3 to 5 videos on this case of a jogger in New York that was killed not far from her house. So whenever I get comments on this video, they tend to be racially motivated and talk about how this was a frame-up job. This is the racist cops just picking a black kid off the street for the hell of it, even though his DNA was found on her phone and he confessed to the murder, giving details. So I went over thinking nothing of it, checked one of them out, saw this one. This was a racial frame-up. Zero evidence against this man and no criminal record. As if having no criminal record matters. He's a young kid. He's about 22. He was probably 21 at the time. And a killer has to have his first kill at some point, right? And he has a history of mental illness, and he goes to a high school for students with learning disabilities. So he's not all there. Now, we can play devil's advocate. Let's just say he didn't do it. I still don't believe that the cops are being racist about it. They pursued someone who was curious in the neighborhood. They got a DNA sample and it matched. So there's no way it's a setup. They just, they're lying about it. I mean, let's just say his DNA magically appeared on her phone and the cops were wrong. That's all I think it is. There's no evidence that there's any racism to this whatsoever. I mean, there's even black cops involved in this case. A black officer is one of the people who helped arrest them. So any claims of racism here are just hysteria. But to get back to the comment, that wasn't the thing that shocked me. The last thing he says is, so glad the jury saw through the farce. So I checked out the other couple of comments, and apparently there had been an update on the case. Hung jury in murder trial over 2016 death of jogger Karina Vetrano. That shocked me, actually. I was quite surprised because, like I said, they have his DNA there at the crime scene, and they have a taped confession. And yeah, some people confess even when they didn't do it. It happens here and there. But check out part of this interrogation footage I actually saw. He seems to be confident in what he's saying, and he doesn't seem to be being pressured much. They ask him a question, he gives details. He gave extra details when they didn't even ask for it.
With this girl jogging, and then one thing led to another because some other situation. I hit in there and stuff like that.
About how many times did you hit her in the face?
Around 5.
Did she scream?
No, because her tooth broke.
I'm sorry? Her tooth broke?
After that, she was just lying there, and then I got her by her ankles and then picked her up from her back and put her in the bushes.
So he tells him how he punched her about 5 times in the face, and they asked if she said anything to him, and he said no, because her tooth got knocked out. Now, he didn't have to divulge that piece of information. All he had to do was say no. And then he talks about how he dragged her by her ankles and threw her in the bushes. Now, if he didn't do this, did he magically line up all those details in the case? You know, was she not found in the bushes? Which would obviously show that he was lying. And if she was found in the bushes, was he just amazingly lucky in that guess? Anyway, I guess let's check out some of the things from this article that tell us what led to the hung jury. I do know that the case will be reopened in January with a brand new jury, so it's not like he's off the hook here. He's still on trial. But honestly, if he didn't do it, I want him to get off. I don't want him to be convicted of a crime he didn't do. But I just hate all these claims of racism for every single thing that occurs between a white and black person. It's sickening and annoying already. It's tiresome at this point. The trial of a man accused of murdering Karina Vetrano, a 30-year-old woman who was killed while jogging in Queens Park in 2016, ended in a mistrial Tuesday night. After a day and a half of deliberations, 12 jurors returned to the courtroom split on whether to find the man, Channel Lewis, 22, guilty of murder and sexual abuse of Miss Vetrano on an early August afternoon in Spring Creek Park. The defense lawyers requested a mistrial, and Justice Michael B. Alloy of State Supreme Court in Queens granted the motion, supporting the jurors' sentiment that their conclusion would not change. I'm inclined to believe them, he said. The victims' family members declined to speak with reporters as they left the courthouse. A person with the family said they needed space. During deliberations, the jury requested a number of pieces of evidence that were presented throughout the trial. That included further examination of the DNA evidence and a viewing of the confession tape, in which Mr. Lewis is seen admitting to the murder on 2 separate occasions after repeatedly denying it to investigators. There's nothing nothing odd about a murderer denying his murder to investigators beforehand. It happens all the time. Robert Mueller, one of Mr. Lewis' lawyers, said that a day and a half had been sufficient time for deliberations. According to their note, they were hopelessly deadlocked, Mr. Mueller said. So what's another day going to do? Mr. Lewis is happy he wasn't convicted, yet he remains in custody. The jury is understanding that DNA is not all it. The confession is not all it, said Jen Chung, a lawyer for Mr. Lewis. There are issues in the case that, as you all see, are much more complex. Well, actually, that's the thing. There are no other issues here. The jury themselves said they needed more time to look at the DNA evidence and the confession. That's all this case is based on. That's all that there is. There's no evidence besides the DNA and his confession. And unless there are major discrepancies in his confession and the crime scene, this trial should be open and shut. And he's not telling us what these other more complex issues are. What are they? Officials with the Queens District Attorney's Office said that they plan to retry the case. A new trial is set to begin January 22nd. The Legal Aid Society released a statement pledging to continue its defense of Mr. Lewis. As we have said since day one, this case is far from conclusive, and the jury's deadlock proves this. Not really. The death of Karina Vetrano is tragic, and our hearts go out to her family, but to rush to criminalize our client is not the answer, nor is it justice. I agree with not rushing to convict him, but to criminalize him? I hate this word. They use it to act as if someone can't be a criminal. You can't accuse someone of being a criminal. You're criminalizing them. Soon after they identified him as a possible suspect, the police confronted Mr. Lewis at his home and asked him for a DNA sample. He confessed to the crime during a 4-hour interrogation after his DNA matched a sample found on Miss Vetrano. I was beating her and was mad at her, he told a Queens Assistant District Attorney in an interview that was videotaped. The prosecutor said Mr. Lewis attacked Miss Vetrano as she jogged through an overgrown section of the park. Medical evidence showed Mr. Lewis repeatedly punched Miss Vetrano, then straightened her after climbing on top of her chest and sexually abusing her, Mr. Leventhal said. Mr. Leventhal said the defendant had conducted 137 web searches on his phone after the police approached him and requested a sample of his DNA, including queries for the phrases Miranda rights and sacrament of penance, a Christian rite of atonement. The defense argued that the interrogation was intense for Mr. Lewis, who was left alone for 2 hours in a windowless room, not given a phone call, and then put in a jail cell. Mr. Mueller also tried to cast doubt on the DNA evidence, suggesting the crime scene had been contaminated. He said Mr. Lewis might have touched a surface that Miss Vetrano touched at some point, and transference of small amounts of DNA might have occurred. People's DNA can end up in places that they've never been, he said. Really? Is DNA like the feather in Forrest Gump now? It just floats around and lands somewhere? Did Mr. Lewis bust a nut in a tissue, throw it out his window, and it flew around to the park where she was and landed on her phone while she was laying there dead? I mean, seriously, she ran through a trail with weeds. Where's his DNA gonna land there that she touches? A plant? A twig? A bush? Mr. Mueller noted that Mr. Lewis, on the night he eventually confessed to the crime, had first denied to the police having anything to do with Miss Vetrano's death several times before he was put in a windowless room for several hours without being allowed to call his family. The defense lawyer also pointed out that several details in the confession were at odds with some of the findings in the autopsy, such as, I would love to know what. At times, Mr. Lewis, who attended a high school for students with learning disabilities, appeared confused in the videotape confession. He occasionally mumbled through his responses. Yeah, he's a little out there. He's not playing with all his marbles. The cause of death had been ruled as strangulation, but Mr. Lewis told an investigator on the night he confessed that Miss Vetrano had drowned in a puddle. He denied sexually assaulting Miss Vetrano, but the victim's body was discovered partially closed with trauma to her vagina and rectum. Finally, in closing arguments, Mr. Mueller said Mr. Lewis's hand injury would have prevented him from throwing a phone 40 feet from the path where the police later found it. I don't believe that. You can still throw a phone when you got all that adrenaline pumping through you. I mean, if he broke his hand on her face and he kept punching her, didn't he? So there's nothing keeping him from throwing the phone, and 40 feet isn't that far. And those are the details in the case that really matter here. The DNA evidence, the fact that he went to the hospital the same day as the murder for an injury on his hand that is consistent with punching someone in the face, and the confession. The confession details, if they match the crime scene and everything, well, it's not going to go well for him. These are the pieces of evidence that matter in the case, and the defense is going to have to come up with something very strong to counter any of this. They're going to have to come up with proof that it's not possible that he broke his hand on her face because of whatever reason. They're gonna have to come up with something big. Now, I could see why the jury was hung. I mean, you got this young kid here who seems a little off, but he doesn't seem dangerous. He seems harmless. And honestly, he could be an alright kid, but we see what a sexless life does to a young man. A life of seclusion and no friends and being weird and a little off in your mental state. These things have driven many people to kill. Even if they weren't bad people, they just get a fit of rage and go off. He doesn't have to necessarily be a serial killer, but just because he looks innocent and is like that doesn't mean he didn't commit this murder. The main thing is here we have to get justice, and we have to get the right justice, and we don't have to throw race baiting in the middle of this bullshit. It's just going to cause more problems, and it's going to affect the trial in a negative way. So hopefully the prosecutors can do some things to tighten up their case if he is the murderer by the time the next trial starts in January, or the defense can come up with some piece of evidence to prove that he wasn't the murderer. Something definitive to show that he couldn't possibly be there at the time. Something. And then hopefully we'll finally have justice in this case. Anyway, guys, have a good night. Faster we